I never thought I'd spend 3 weeks sleeping in my truck cab, parked outside my own house, watching the lights turn on and off through the windshield like I was some kind of detective in a bad movie. I'm a regional sales rep. I drive pharmaceutical accounts across the Southeast. I'm home maybe 8-9 days a month, and I came home early one Tuesday in March to find out that someone had been living in my house while I was gone. My name is Doug Calloway. I'm 52, divorced 11 years now, and I own a 3-bedroom Craftsman in a quiet neighborhood in Marietta, Georgia. Bought it after the split because it was close to my daughter's school, back when that still mattered for scheduling. She's 23 now and living in Austin, so the house is just mine. My stuff, my space, my mortgage. I like it that way. Or I used to. My territory runs from Atlanta down through Savannah, west to Birmingham, and I do a loop that takes about 3 weeks out of every 4. I drive a company car during the week, leave it at the regional hub, take my personal truck home on weekends when I actually get home. The house sits empty most of the time, and I've always been fine with that. I have a neighbor, an older guy named Frank, who lives 2 doors down, and we have an informal arrangement where he checks the mail and calls me if anything looks off. I also hired a home maintenance company about 2 years ago, Prestige Home Care, to do quarterly walkthroughs and handle any minor issues, leaky gutters, pest control, that kind of thing. They had a key. I thought that was smart. Turned out it was the single worst decision I ever made. It started with a voicemail. I was sitting in a Cracker Barrel parking lot outside of Macon, eating a sad desk lunch of crackers and peanut butter when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, so I let it go. Listened to the message about 20 minutes later when I was back on I-16. The voice was a woman, matter of fact. Said her name was Judy, and she was a neighbor of mine, couple streets over. Said she'd seen cars in my driveway on several different nights over the past few weeks, lights on inside, and figured I'd want to know. Left her number. I pulled off at a rest stop and called her back. She said she walked her dog past my street regularly and had noticed it maybe 4 or 5 times in the past month. Different cars each time, she said. Sometimes 2 cars at once. She thought maybe I'd started renting a room or something. She wasn't trying to cause trouble. She just thought it was odd because she knew I was rarely there. I thanked her and sat there for a minute with the engine running and the air conditioning going, and that uneasy feeling you get when something is wrong, but you can't name it yet. I called Frank. He'd been out of town visiting his brother in Knoxville for 2 weeks, he said. Hadn't been by the house. Hadn't noticed anything before he left. I thought about it for about 5 miles of highway, and then I turned around and drove back to Marietta. I got there a little after 9 at night. I didn't go straight home. I parked on the next street over and walked around the block, coming at my house from the side. The porch light was off, which was wrong. I leave it on a timer that runs from dusk to 11. Someone had turned it off. There was a car in my driveway, a silver Honda, not mine. My garage door was closed. The house looked dark from the front except for a faint glow along the bottom of the living room curtains, like the TV was on. I stood at the end of my own driveway for I don't know how long. My heart was going fast. Every instinct I had said to walk up there, knock on my own front door, and demand to know what was going on. But something made me stop. The car wasn't some teenager's rust bucket. It was clean, recent model, and it was parked straight and careful like someone who planned to be there a while. This wasn't a random squatter. This felt deliberate. I went back to my truck, drove to a Marriott about 4 miles away, and checked in for the night. I barely slept. I went over everything I could think of. Nobody had a key except Prestige Home Care. I'd never given one to anyone else. The lots were original to the house, which I'd always meant to change and never did. Someone had access. Someone with a key, coming and going, using my house while I was on the road. The next morning, I drove to a Home Depot and bought 2 wireless security cameras and a video doorbell, the kind that uploads to the cloud. I also bought a combination lockbox and a deadbolt. I went to my house at 8 in the morning, parked down the street, and watched for 20 minutes. The silver Honda was gone. I let myself in through the back, changed into a different mindset the second I crossed the threshold. The house smelled wrong. Not bad exactly, but different. Someone else's soap or shampoo, something faintly floral that wasn't mine. The kitchen sink had dishes in it, a bowl, a glass, a pan. None of them mine, or rather, they were my dishes, but I hadn't left them dirty. I'd been gone for 10 days, and I always clean up before a long trip. The living room. The throw blanket from the back of my couch was unfolded, draped across the armchair. The remote was on the seat cushion instead of the side table where I always put it. Little things. The kind of things you only notice if you know exactly how you left them. I walked down the hall to the guest bedroom, the one I kept set up for when my daughter visited. The bed was made, but pulled tight differently than the way I make it. There was a phone charger plugged in at the nightstand. Not mine. My bedroom was untouched. That was the first thing I checked, and the first thing that gave me a moment of relief before I caught myself being relieved about something that was still deeply wrong. I found a man's jacket hanging on the hook by the back door. Dark green, Columbia brand, size large. I had never seen it before in my life. I set up the cameras carefully, one in the corner of the living room behind a stack of books, angled at the front door and main area, one in the kitchen, up on top of the refrigerator where the angle made it nearly invisible. The doorbell camera I mounted myself, and it took longer than I wanted, nervous the whole time that someone would come back while I was standing there with a drill. I also changed the back door lock, added the new deadbolt, and kept the old one so from the outside nothing looked different. I did not change the front door lock. I wanted whoever this was to be able to come and go and not know anything had changed. I straightened nothing. Left the dishes, left the jacket, left the phone charger, walked out of my own house and drove back to the Marriott. The first alert came at 4:17 that afternoon. I was sitting on the hotel bed with my laptop and a bad cup of room coffee when my phone buzzed with a notification from the doorbell camera. I opened the app and watched the live feed. A man walked up my front path carrying a paper bag, groceries by the look of it. Late 30s, maybe 40, heavy set, wearing the Braves cap and a gray hoodie. He didn't ring the bell. He pulled a key out of his jacket pocket and let himself in like he owned the place. My house, my key, my front door. I watched through the indoor camera as he moved to the kitchen, unpacked the bag. I could see the top of what looked like a six-pack in a takeout container and then disappeared into the living room. The TV came on. He sat down in my armchair with my blanket and started watching what looked like a basketball game. I recorded everything. Over the next 4 days, I documented his routine. He showed up most evenings between 4 and 6. He cooked or brought food. He watched TV, used my Wi-Fi, slept in the guest room. He never touched my bedroom. He showered in the hall bathroom. He was, in some clinical and completely insane way, a tidy house guest. He wiped down the stove, didn't leave wet towels on the floor. On the third day, a different car showed up. This one was a white Kia, and the woman who got out was younger, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled back. She knocked. He let her in. They sat at my kitchen table with a laptop and what looked like printed pages and talked for almost 2 hours. That's when I started getting the feeling this was something more organized than one person crashing somewhere. I zoomed into the camera footage as much as the resolution would allow. The printed pages looked like some kind of form, maybe a lease or an agreement, but I couldn't make out the text. The laptop screen showed something I recognized, a listing page. The layout was familiar, white background, photos down the side, pricing on the right. I pulled up Verbo on my own laptop and searched my address. It was there, my house, listed as Charming Marietta Craftsman, minutes from the Battery. 14 photos of my living room, my kitchen, my backyard with the bird feeder I'd put up 2 summers ago. Nightly rate, $179. Weekend rate, $219. Weekend rate, $219. We've been going back 8 weeks, 9 of them, all 4 and 5 stars. Cozy, clean, great location. Host was responsive to questions. Felt like a home away from home. I actually laughed. The kind of laugh that comes out when something is so absurd your brain doesn't know what else to do with it. Then I sat there for a while, not laughing. Someone had photographed my house. Staged it maybe, or just photographed it as is. Written the description, set up an account. Collected payments. Hosted guests, 9 of them in 2 months, in my home while I was driving through Mississippi and Alabama, selling blood pressure medication and cholesterol drugs to family practice doctors. I went back to the footage of the 2 of them at my kitchen table. I watched it again, slowly. At one point, the man turned his head and I got a decent shot of his profile. At another point, the woman leaned over to point at something on the screen, and her face was nearly straight at the camera. I took screenshots and I did what anyone would do. I started searching. It took me most of an evening. The man's name was Curtis, and he wasn't hard to find once I had a clear enough image. A Facebook profile that was mostly public, a face that matched. Curtis ran what his profile described as a short-term property consulting business. That phrase meant nothing, so I kept looking. An LLC registered in Georgia that I found through the Secretary of State's website, listed under property management and rental services, 3 years old. The woman took longer. I found her through a photography website of all things. She was a freelance real estate photographer. Her portfolio was linked on a LinkedIn page. Interior shots, exterior shots, staging, virtual tours, professional work. I thought about what Judy had said. Different cars each time. Multiple nights, I pulled up the Verbo listing and read the reviews more carefully. One of them, dated about 6 weeks back, mentioned easy self-check-in, and the host left great instructions, self-check-in. So guests weren't even meeting Curtis in person. They were being sent a code or key location and letting themselves in. Guests who had no idea they were sleeping in a stranger's house, that the money they'd paid wasn't going to an actual owner. Then I got to the part that kept me awake again. There was a review that mentioned, in passing, that the host said the owner travels frequently for work. They knew my schedule. Whoever set this up knew when I was gone, knew my patterns, and the only entity that knew all of that with any precision was Prestige Home Care. I'd given them my schedule when I signed the service contract. I updated it every quarter. They knew exactly when the house would be empty. I called their main number the next morning and asked to speak to whoever handled my account. Got transferred twice and ended up leaving a voicemail. Then I called back and asked a simple question. Had they had any staff turnover recently? The woman I spoke to was pleasant and confused. She mentioned that they'd had a contractor they worked with, Handyman Services, who had stopped working with them a few months ago. I asked for a name. She hesitated and said she'd have to look into it. I didn't push further. I didn't want to tip anything. That same day, I got the break I needed from an unlikely direction. I was watching the footage from the evening before and I noticed something I'd missed. When Curtis left, he had a brief conversation on his phone in the driveway. At one point, he turned toward the house and I could see him talking. The doorbell camera had audio. Not perfect, but enough. I turned up my laptop speakers and listened 4 times. Yeah, it's good through the end of the month. Note, the Callaway place is fine. He's not due back until the 15th. The other one on Dunwoody has the turnover on Friday. Make sure your guy confirms the linens. The Callaway place. He knew my name. The other one on Dunwoody. There was at least one other property. I pulled up everything I'd recorded, organized it into folders by date and time, and the next morning I drove to the Cobb County Police Department. The officer I spoke to initially was polite but measured in the way that cops are when someone sits down and starts explaining something complicated. He took notes, nodded, asked a few clarifying questions. When I showed him the Verbo listing, he paused for a moment and said he'd like to get a detective involved. Detective's name was Paul, and he was thorough. He spent an hour with me going through the footage, the listing, the screenshots. He explained what they were potentially dealing with: criminal trespass, theft by conversion, which in Georgia applies when someone takes control of someone else's property for financial gain, and fraud. He said the connection to a property management company, if it held, would make it significantly more serious. He asked me not to confront Curtis or anyone else, not to change the locks yet, and to keep the cameras running. I went back to driving my territory. For the next 9 days I watched my house from hotel rooms in Dauphin and Pensacola and Mobile. Curtis came and went. 2 more guest stays happened. I could tell by the different cars and the patterns on the camera. I documented everything and forwarded the footage to Detective Paul every evening. The connection to Prestige Home Care came through faster than I expected. The contractor who'd left their company was a man who had worked as a handyman and locksmith. He'd had access to keys for multiple client properties. When Prestige terminated his contract, apparently over some unrelated billing dispute, they asked for keys back, and he returned what he said he had. They had no audit system for the copies. He had worked with Prestige for 4 years and had made copies of keys for at least 11 properties over that time. He and Curtis had grown up together in the same county in South Georgia. Curtis ran the rentals and handled the guest bookings. The photographer handled listings, photos, and the online presence. The handyman supplied access. 3 properties confirmed, possibly more. The sting happened on a Saturday afternoon when Detective Paul had confirmed via my camera feed that Curtis was inside and a guest check-in was scheduled for that evening. They let the guest, a couple from Ohio in town for a wedding, arrive first, met them outside, explained the situation, and took their statements, then knocked on my front door. I watched the whole thing from a live feed on my phone, parked 2 blocks away. When Curtis opened my front door and saw the detective and 2 uniformed officers, he looked confused more than anything, like he genuinely hadn't considered that this moment would come. He looked back into the house toward the kitchen like he was checking for an exit. There wasn't one. They arrested him there. The photographer was picked up the same afternoon at her apartment. The handyman, whose name I learned was Stan Whitmore, was arrested the following Monday. Curtis was charged with criminal trespass, theft by conversion, and wire fraud. The photographer faced fraud charges related to the listings and collection of funds. Stan was charged with theft by deception and conspiracy. All 3 also faced civil liability to the property owners. There were 4 of us in total once the investigation was complete. The trial was 11 months later. I testified and brought my documentation, 6 weeks of cloud-stored footage, time-stamped and organized. The prosecutor called it some of the cleanest evidence presentation she'd seen from a civilian. Curtis's attorney tried to argue that the guests were legitimate customers who had transacted in good faith, that his client was providing a service. The judge had very little patience for the framing. Curtis got 3 years. The photographer got 18 months suspended with probation and restitution. Stan Whitmore got 2 years and lost his locksmith certification permanently. Restitution across the 4 owners came to just under $40,000 total. My portion covered the security system I'd installed, months of utility overuse from continuous occupancy, the locksmith I finally hired to rekey every lock in the house, and something the claims form called loss of use and privacy, which is a legal way of saying strangers slept in your guest room and ate out of your refrigerator for 2 months, and there's no number that fully covers that. I didn't sell the house. I thought about it, walked through the rooms a few times in the weeks after the arrest, trying to decide if I could still feel comfortable there. I kept looking at the guest room, the kitchen, the back door where I'd found the jacket hanging, like someone lived there. I kept the house. We painted the guest room, put in new bedding. It helped more than I expected. What I couldn't fully fix was the feeling about Prestige Home Care. They issued a formal apology and updated their key management procedures after the investigation. The 4 of us also filed a civil suit. We settled, and the terms were confidential. But it was enough to matter. What stayed with me, though, was the basic fact. I had paid a company to protect my property, and an employee of that company had handed a criminal the keys to my house. Not out of carelessness, not as a one-time mistake, deliberately, repeatedly, for money. That breach of trust is something I still think about when I pull out of my driveway for a 2-week run, One of the other owners was a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn who had moved to an assisted living facility and was renting out her house while she figured out her long-term situation. She was 71 years old, and when she found out what had happened, she called me and cried on the phone for 10 minutes. She kept saying she felt stupid, like she should have known, like she'd done something wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. None of us had. We'd done what reasonable people do. Hired professionals, given them access, trusted that the system worked the way it's supposed to. And someone saw that trust as an opportunity. I've learned a few things from all of this that I wish I'd known earlier. The first is to monitor your utilities even when you're gone. My electricity bill had ticked up over 2 billing cycles before any of this came to light. I'd chalked it up to seasonal variation and not looked closely. A spike in usage when a home should be empty is a red flag that doesn't require cameras or detectives to notice, just attention. The second is that a key handed to a service company is not the same as a key you can account for. Smart locks with temporary access codes you can revoke remotely, would have ended this before it started. I have them now. Every door. The third is to search your own address on every short-term rental platform. Vibro, Airbnb, Furnished Finder, all of them. It takes 10 minutes. I had no idea this was even a thing people did until it was my listing I was looking at. The fourth is to tell your immediate neighbors exactly what your travel schedule is and ask them to call you directly, not just note it and mention it later. Judy did the right thing. If she'd had my number and called the first time she saw something off, this would have ended 6 weeks sooner. The fifth, and this is the one I think about most, is that methodical documentation beats confrontation every single time. My instinct that first night was to walk up to my own front door and demand answers. If I had, Curtis would have claimed some plausible confusion, left, moved the operation to a different property, and I'd have had nothing. The cameras and the weeks of footage were the reason the prosecutor could make the case stick. Evidence doesn't feel as satisfying in the moment as confrontation, but it's the only thing that actually works. I still travel the same territory. Still gone most of every month. My daughter came to visit last fall, first time in 2 years, and she stayed in the guest room, the repainted one with the new comforter, and I sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee while she slept in, and it felt like mine again. Just mine. The way it's supposed to. My security system now covers every entry point, every window, 2 indoor cameras that I can check from anywhere. My neighbors have my cell number saved as a contact with a note that says, "Call me first, text second, don't wait." I check the cameras every single night before I go to sleep, wherever I am. I know that probably sounds like anxiety. Maybe it is. But I also know that the night I drove back from Macon and stood at the end of my own driveway watching the glow behind my living room curtains, I made the right call. I didn't go in, I got evidence. I let the system work. It worked. That part still surprises me a little. The thing I keep coming back to is that night I stood at the end of my own driveway and didn't go in. That moment felt like weakness at the time. I was standing there in the dark looking at a silver Honda I didn't recognize and a faint glow behind my own curtains, and every part of me wanted to walk up and pound on that door. It was my house, my lock, my key that someone else was using. The anger was real, and it was justified, but something made me stop, turn around, and drive to a Marriott instead. I think about that decision a lot. What Curtis was doing had a logic to it. He found a gap, a house that sat empty, a service company with loose key management, a schedule someone had handed over without a second thought, and he built a business inside that gap. That's not a defense of what he did. It was fraud and trespass and a genuine violation of 4 people's lives, including a 71-year-old woman named Evelyn who cried on the phone and kept asking what she'd done wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong, but the operation existed because people like me created conditions that made it possible. We trusted without verifying. We handed over access and assumed the systems around us were sound. That assumption was wrong, and it cost all of us. I don't say that to be hard on myself. I say it because understanding how something happened is the only way to make sure it doesn't happen again. The gap between what I assumed and what was actually true, that gap was where Curtis built his business. Once I understood that, I stopped feeling like a victim who'd been randomly unlucky and started thinking like someone who could actually fix things. That shift mattered. The patience required to document everything rather than confront immediately 6 weeks of hotel rooms and daily footage reviews was genuinely hard. I'm not a patient person by nature. Ask anyone who's driven with me on the interstate, but I understood, somewhere in that Marriott parking lot on the first night, that emotion without evidence was useless. I could be furious. I could feel violated. And I did, both of those things, for weeks. But if I wanted a real outcome, not just the satisfaction of a confrontation that Curtis would have walked away from, I had to be disciplined about it. I had to think more clearly than I felt. That's the part I want people to hear. Not the security tips, though those matter. The part about choosing the harder, slower, more deliberate response over the immediate one. It doesn't come naturally. It costs something, but it's the difference between venting and actually winning. Evelyn got her restitution. The couple from Ohio who unknowingly checked into my house for a weekend got their money refunded and an apology from the platform. Curtis got 3 years. The system worked, but only because I gave it something to work with. Your home is yours. When that gets violated, the anger is legitimate. What you do with it is the only thing you can control.